My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 24 years old. And the first home I ever loved was the same home I was forced to leave when I was 9. My father died when I was still young enough to think adults always told the truth, and homes stayed with the people who loved them. He left that 2-story house in the Chicago suburbs to me, and for a little while I thought that meant I would always belong there. I was wrong. Just a few weeks after the funeral, my mother brought a new man into the house, a man with a heavy voice, a warehouse job, and the kind of confidence that fills a room before kindness ever does. She told me I needed to call him Dad. I refused. I still remember the way he looked at me after that, like I was a problem taking up space in a house he had already decided was his. Then came the sentence that stayed with me longer than the funeral, longer than the silence, longer than the years I spent pretending I was over it. He told me that if I wanted to keep living there, I had to pay rent like everybody else. I was 9 years old, standing in the hallway of the house my own father had left me, being told I was a guest in my own life. I did not scream. I did not beg. I picked up a small bag, swallowed everything I wanted to say, and walked out to live with my grandmother. I said nothing then, but silence has a way of growing teeth when you give it enough years. 15 years later, the people who thought I would never come back learned exactly what I had been holding on to all that time. Before I tell you what he said next and what happened after I walked away from my own front door, tell me this. What time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from tonight? I really want to see how far this story travels. Living with my grandmother should have felt temporary at first, like one of those strange childhood detours adults promise will all make sense soon, but it did not take me long to understand that nobody was coming to fix what had happened. My grandmother, Evelyn, never lied to me the way other adults did. She did not tell me everything would go back to normal, because she knew it would not. She just made room for me in her small house in Lombard, folded my clothes into a dresser that still smelled like cedar, and started rebuilding me one ordinary day at a time. I went to school. I did my homework at her kitchen table. I learned how to keep my voice calm when people asked where I lived now. On holidays, I learned how to smile when somebody said family is everything, because by then I already knew that family could also be the first thing that teaches you how disposable you are. My mother came around just enough to make the wound stay fresh. A few times a year she would stop by in a nice coat, carrying a grocery store pie or some small gift that always felt like an excuse more than an offering. She would talk about how busy life had become, how hard marriage was, how much responsibility she had now, and somehow none of those speeches ever included a real apology. She never said, "I am sorry I let a stranger talk to you that way in your father's house." She never said, "I am sorry I left you to figure out what rejection feels like before you were even 10. Instead, she talked about sacrifice, about how complicated adults can be, about how one day I would understand. What I understood instead was that she had built a new life, and I was the piece that did not match the furniture. She had given my room away. She had turned my father into a subject nobody wanted mentioned. She had allowed that house to become theirs in conversation long before they ever earned the right to call it that. As I got older, I stopped expecting warmth from her. I stopped waiting for birthdays to matter. I stopped hoping Thanksgiving would include an invitation that felt sincere. My grandmother never pushed me to hate her, and maybe that is one reason I grew up with a conscience instead of bitterness spilling out everywhere. She taught me how to hold pain without letting it rot me from the inside. She also taught me something else that would matter later. She kept paperwork. Every tax record, every letter, every copy of the will, every formal document related to my father's estate went into a locked metal box in her closet until I was old enough to understand what any of it meant. When I turned 18, she sat me down at the kitchen table and slid the box toward me like it contained a second version of my life. That was the day I read my father's name on those pages with adult eyes. Daniel Bennett, sole owner, property transferred by will to his daughter, Claire Bennett. My mother's signature was there too, acknowledging the transfer. My hands shook when I saw it, not because I was surprised, but because for the first time I had proof that what happened to me was not just cruel. It was wrong in a way the law could understand. Still, I did nothing. I went to college. I earned a degree in marketing at Illinois State. I got a job with a real estate software company in downtown Chicago. I built a life that looked stable from the outside, and for a while I convinced myself that stability was enough. But even then, I kept that paperwork in my own safe, tucked behind old report cards and my father's watch, because some part of me knew the story was not finished. Some people think revenge begins with anger. Mine began with patience. By the time I was 24, my life finally looked like something my grandmother could point to with pride. I had a steady job, a clean apartment in Oak Park, and a man in my life who never once mistook control for love. Ethan Parker was the kind of person who listened all the way through an answer instead of preparing his own while you were still speaking. He was a civil engineer, practical in the best ways, warm in the quiet ways. And when he proposed to me on a cold Saturday evening near the river, my first thought was not about the ring. It was about home. Real home. Not the apartment I rented. Not the safe little place my grandmother had made for me out of kindness. I thought about the two-story house in the suburbs that my father had bought before I was born, the one with the narrow front porch and the maple tree out back, the one I still saw in dreams exactly as it had been before grief and selfishness moved in. Ethan and I started looking at houses the way engaged couples do, with too many tabs open and too many numbers scribbled onto notepads. We toured places with bland gray walls and tiny yards and kitchen islands that looked staged for people who never cooked. We talked about mortgage rates, commute times, and whether we wanted something move-in ready or something we could make our own. Then, one Sunday afternoon, while we were driving back from a showing in Naperville, Ethan asked me a simple question. If you could live anywhere, where would it be? I did not answer right away because the answer embarrassed me. It felt childish to still want the house I had lost at 9, but once the thought surfaced, it would not go back down. That night, I drove to my grandmother's house alone. She took one look at my face and knew exactly where my mind had gone. We sat at the same kitchen table where I had once read the will, and I asked her questions I had spent years avoiding. Were they still living there? Had they ever paid anything toward the property? Did anybody ever challenge the will again? My grandmother answered each question carefully. Yes, they were still there. No, they had never paid me a dime. And no, nobody had overturned anything because the documents were airtight. Then her expression changed. She told me things had gotten ugly in that house. Ray had lost his warehouse management job after a screaming match with his supervisor. Kelsey, his daughter, was in the middle of a bitter divorce and had moved back into the house with boxes, debt, and a level of entitlement that made the whole place feel even smaller. Travis had bounced between jobs and had started borrowing money from anybody willing to believe his promises. My mother was trying to keep up appearances, but the bank had started calling about other debts, and there was talk around church that they might be close to losing more than their pride. I remember sitting there with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, waiting for myself to feel satisfaction. I did not. What I felt was something sharper and cleaner. Clarity. They had not just taken advantage of me. They had taken my father's last gift and treated it like a free shelter for every bad decision they made. While Ethan and I were budgeting and building and planning honestly, they were living in a house that never belonged to them, leaning on a lie they had told so long they probably started believing it. My grandmother, being who she was, told me not to let bitterness decide my next step. She said that if I did this, I had to do it because it was right, not because it would feel good to watch them panic. That advice stayed with me. I went home, opened the safe in my closet, and spread the paperwork across the floor. The will, the transfer documents, tax receipts, copies of correspondence from the estate lawyer. The evidence did not look dramatic. It looked boring, official, almost cold. But to me, it felt like 15 years of silence finally turning into a voice. I called a property attorney the next morning before work. Her name was Rebecca Sloan, and after 20 minutes on the phone, she said the sentence that changed everything. Claire, if these documents are what you say they are, you have every right to take your house back. The first thing Rebecca told me was not to do anything emotional, impulsive, or theatrical. She said people lose strong cases every day because they get hungry for a scene before they secure a result. So I listened. I gathered every document she asked for, scanned every page, sent over proof that the property taxes had continued to be paid through the estate arrangements and later through funds my grandmother helped me manage, and answered every question she had with the kind of precision grief had trained into me. When she was satisfied, she told me to give my mother one chance to respond like a decent human being before we escalated. I wrote the email myself. I kept it polite, short, and impossible to twist into aggression. I explained that I intended to reclaim possession of the house my father left me. I said I planned to repair it and move in after my wedding. I asked that we handle the transition respectfully and privately. I even offered reasonable time for them to make arrangements. I read that email 5 times before sending it, and every version of me that had ever wanted a mother was still alive enough to hope the reply might hurt a little less than the years had. It did not. Her answer came the next morning. 3 lines. Cold, clipped, and almost irritated that I had interrupted her day. She told me not to disrupt her family with old drama. She said the house had been their home for years. Then she ended with the sentence that finally killed whatever was left of my hesitation. Stop bothering us. Not let's talk. Not, this is painful. Not, I know I owe you an explanation. Just stop bothering us. As if I were some unstable stranger sending nuisance emails instead of the daughter she had watched get pushed out of her own front door. I forwarded the reply to Rebecca, and she called me within the hour to say what I already knew. We were done trying the soft way. Still, before the legal notice went out, I made one mistake. I went to the house. Some part of me needed to see it with adult eyes, needed to stand in front of it and let reality either match or correct the version I had carried in my head for 15 years. The neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered, but the house itself hit me like a hand to the chest. The porch had been repainted an ugly dark color. The flower beds my father used to tend were gone, replaced by gravel and plastic edging. A rusted basketball hoop leaned over the driveway. Even from the sidewalk, I could see that they had changed the front windows, and not well. The whole place looked tired in a way that made me instantly angry, as if neglect itself had become another insult. I should have left then. Instead, I walked up and knocked. My mother opened the door, and for 1 second all I saw was age. She looked older than I had prepared myself for. Smaller, somehow, with tension set into the corners of her mouth like it had become part of her face. Then recognition hardened her expression, and the moment passed. She did not invite me in. She did not ask how I was. She just stared like I was there to sell her something she did not want. Before I could even speak, Ray's voice came from deeper inside the house, asking who it was. He stepped into the hallway when he saw me. Bigger than memory had preserved him. Grayer now, but still carrying that same ugly confidence that once told a child to pay rent. He laughed without humor and said I had nerve showing up after all these years. I told him calmly that I had every right to be there. He moved closer and said no, I did not. Because this was his house and his family's home. My mother stood there and let him say it. She did not correct him. She did not look ashamed. She just crossed her arms and watched me like she was waiting for me to make a scene, so they could feel justified. I looked past them into the hallway and saw almost nothing of my father left. No framed photos, no old console table, no trace of the man who had worked for that house and loved me in it. I left before my anger could turn stupid. When I got back to my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could not put the key in the ignition on the first try. But when I finally drove away, I was calmer than I had been in years. Some doors only need to close one last time before you stop knocking and start using the law. A week later would have been my father's 15th death anniversary, and I decided to mark it in a way that matched the kind of man he had been. He was not flashy when he was alive, and I did not want some dramatic social media grief performance after he was gone. My grandmother and I arranged a small memorial service at the church she still attended, the same place where my father had once helped fix loose pews and carry folding tables into the basement for community dinners. We kept it simple: a short prayer, a few flowers, a donation drive for winter coats and canned food in his name. I paid for coffee and sandwiches for everyone who came. Ethan stood beside me through the planning without trying to direct any of it, and that alone made me love him more. I mailed an invitation to my mother and sent a digital copy as well, because I wanted there to be no excuse later, no story about how she had never been told. I already knew she probably would not come. But some part of me wanted the record to show that I had offered dignity before I demanded accountability. Her reply never came. Instead, 2 days before the service, I got a text from Kelsey, Ray's daughter, from a number I had not saved, but recognized immediately from the area code and the tone. She wrote that dragging up the dead after 15 years was pathetic and unhealthy, and that some people needed to move on instead of punishing everyone else for their childhood issues. I stared at the message for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it told me exactly how they talked about me inside that house when I was not there. Like I was the problem, like memory itself was some kind of character flaw. I did not answer. The next evening, Ray called. I let it ring twice, then picked up. He did not bother with greetings. He went straight into anger, accusing me of harassing my mother, stirring up old wounds, trying to embarrass the family, and acting ungrateful after all they had supposedly done for me. That word, ungrateful, almost made me laugh. There is something truly incredible about people who steal from you and then demand appreciation for the parts they did not steal harder. I let him talk until he repeated that line about how they had housed me, fed me, and tried to make me part of the family. Then I cut in and said the truth in the calmest voice I could manage. You did not house me. You threw me out. You did not make me part of the family. You made sure I understood I was not part of it. And that house was never yours to offer or deny in the first place. There was a pause on the line, the kind that tells you have finally said something that landed. Then he snapped back, louder this time, saying my father was gone. Life moved on, and that if I had any decency, I would leave the people living there alone. I told him my father being gone was exactly why I was no longer willing to. He hung up on me, but not before warning me that I was making a mistake. The memorial service was the following Sunday morning. My mother did not come. Neither did anyone from that house. The people who did show up were my grandmother, Ethan, a few older relatives, some church members who still remembered my father, and 2 former neighbors who told me stories I had never heard about how he used to shovel driveways after snowstorms for people who could not do it themselves. I smiled through most of it, but toward the end, while standing beside the table of donated coats, I had one of those strange, quiet moments where grief and certainty stop fighting each other. My father had not left me that house so I could spend my life feeling guilty for wanting it back. He had left it to me because he loved me, because he wanted something stable and protected to remain mine, even if he could not stay. Leaving that house in the hands of people who erased him was not mercy. It was surrender. After the service, I sat in my car in the church parking lot, opened my phone, and sent one message to Rebecca. They had their chance. File everything. Once the legal process began, the story stopped being about memory and started becoming about evidence, deadlines, and the kind of pressure people cannot cry their way out of. Rebecca sent the first formal demand letter, followed by notice to vacate and all the paperwork required to begin the possession action. She warned me that people who have lived off somebody else's property for years almost never leave gracefully, especially when they have convinced themselves longevity equals ownership. She was right. Within days, my phone lit up with voicemails from my mother that swung wildly between tears and blame. One minute she was sobbing that I was tearing the family apart. The next, she was accusing me of trying to make her homeless out of spite. Then came the guilt. How could you do this to me? After everything I carried on my shoulders. After everything I survived. Notice what was never in those messages. Not once did she say I should not have let that happen to you. Not once did she say I failed you. It was all still about her pain, her fear, her image. Ray's approach was more direct. He left one voicemail in particular that Rebecca immediately told me to save in 3 different places. He said I was playing a dangerous game, that I had no idea who I was pushing, and that if I showed up at the house again without warning, he would deal with me himself. He did not quite say enough to sound clever, because men like him rarely do when they are angry. He said enough to sound threatening, stupid, and useful. Rebecca smiled when she heard it in her office. That message, she told me, was a gift. My grandmother's house became their next target. My mother showed up unannounced one afternoon while I was at work, crying on the porch, talking loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, saying she only wanted to speak mother to daughter and did not understand why I had become so cold. My grandmother let her inside out of manners, but not out of weakness. When I got there, my mother was seated at the kitchen table in the exact chair where I had once done spelling homework after she left me there for good. The irony would have been poetic if it had not made me so angry. She stood up when I walked in and immediately reached for the performance she knew best. Tears, trembling hands, a wounded voice. She said I was punishing her for mistakes made a long time ago, and that Ray had been harsh, but had only wanted order in the house. Order. That was her word for a child being told to pay rent to stay in her own home. I told her not to rewrite what happened. I told her I was not confused, and I was not 9 anymore. Then, because I had carried it long enough, I laid it all out. I reminded her that she had watched another man claim authority over me before I had even buried my father in my heart. I reminded her that when I lived with Grandma, she came around just enough to protect her conscience, not enough to protect me. I reminded her that there had been birthdays she missed, Christmases she reduced to rushed visits, and years of my life she treated like an inconvenient branch of a tree she had already cut down. She started crying harder, but I did not stop. I told her the cruelest part was not even that she let them take the house. It was that she let them make me feel like I had imagined what was mine. She tried one last tactic then. She said they had nowhere to go. She said Kelsey was already struggling after the divorce, that Travis was trying to get back on his feet, that Ray was under stress, that she was doing her best. For the first time in my life, I answered her without worrying whether she would still love me afterward. That concern had kept me soft for too long. I told her their instability was not my inheritance to carry. I told her I had spent 15 years building a life without asking them for anything, and they did not get to turn around now and ask me to sacrifice my future so they could continue living in comfort inside a lie. She left that day with red eyes and no victory. Ray called twice that night and once the next morning. I did not pick up. Rebecca handled everything after that. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. which in a strange way made it even more satisfying. I had spent years imagining a dramatic showdown where truth finally crashed into them like a storm, but the courtroom was quiet, controlled, and uninterested in their mythology. The judge looked at the will, the transfer documents, the chain of possession, the notices, and the communications. Ray's lawyer tried to suggest there had been an informal family arrangement and implied that I had abandoned any claim by waiting so long. Rebecca shut that down piece by piece. A child cannot consent to being displaced from her own inheritance. A displaced child does not lose ownership because adults exploit her silence. Long occupancy does not create rights against a lawful owner under these facts. Their side also made the mistake of leaning too hard on sympathy, financial hardship, a daughter's divorce, employment troubles, years of residence. The judge listened politely and then returned to the only question that mattered. Who owns the property? The answer was me. The order for possession came through, followed by enforcement instructions. On top of that, Rebecca advised me to pursue recovery for unauthorized modifications and visible damage to parts of the home they had altered without permits. When she explained that those costs could become their responsibility too, I felt no thrill, just a grim sense of balance. Actions add up. Neglect adds up. Disrespect adds up. The law was finally counting what they had spent 15 years pretending did not matter. They had 30 days to prepare, and still they delayed, argued, and hoped I would break first. What they never understood was that I had already survived the hardest part of this story when I was 9. Paperwork was easy. The morning they lost the house began before sunrise. The air had that cold, sharp edge late fall brings to the Chicago suburbs, the kind that wakes every nerve in your body whether you are ready or not. I arrived in a dark coat with Ethan on one side of me and Rebecca on the other. And even though I had imagined that moment more times than I could count, the reality of it was quieter than revenge stories usually are. No music, no speech. Just the sound of tires on damp pavement and my own heartbeat trying to keep pace with something 15 years overdue. A few minutes later, the sheriff's deputies pulled up with the court order. That was the detail that mattered most to me. I was not there to bully anybody, to scare them, or to drag them out through some petty fit of rage. I was there because the law had looked at the truth and answered in my favor. The deputies knocked first, then announced themselves. What happened next sounded almost exactly like the chaos I had once imagined, only sadder up close, shouting from inside. A crash somewhere near the front hallway. My mother's voice rising into panic. Ray barking over everyone like volume could change ownership. When the door finally opened, the house spilled its tension right out onto the porch. My mother looked stunned, pale, and suddenly older than I had ever seen her. Ray looked furious in the way weak men do when the room no longer belongs to them. Behind them, I caught sight of Kelsey crying and Travis pacing with his hands in his hair, both of them realizing too late that arrogance is not a legal defense. One deputy read the order calmly and clearly. They were to vacate. Any further obstruction would create additional consequences for them, not for me. Ray tried to argue, then tried to posture, stepping forward like he could intimidate a badge, the way he once intimidated a grieving child. That ended fast. He was warned once. When he kept pushing, his tone changed from aggression to bargaining so quickly it would have been funny if it had not taken 15 years to witness. He asked for more time. He said they had nowhere to go. He said this was cruelty. I stood there listening and thought about the day I walked out with one small bag and nobody asking where I would sleep. My grandmother had taken me in because love made room. They had taken me out because greed did not. That difference was everything. The deputies gave them a short final window to gather essentials and move the process along, and the next 2 hours were the ugliest kind of honesty. People show you who they are when they are losing something they never had the right to keep. Kelsey cried like the world had betrayed her. Travis cursed under his breath and blamed everyone but himself. My mother kept looking at me, waiting for some sign of softness she could still use. Ray moved through the house in jerks and stomps, grabbing things with the indignation of a man outraged that Consequence had finally learned his address. And there I was, standing in the driveway of the home my father left me, feeling not triumphant exactly, but steady, deeply, finally steady. At one point, my mother stepped toward me and asked in this cracked voice whether I was really going to do this. I looked at her and realized how many years I had wasted hoping for a mother while standing in front of a woman who only wanted access to my mercy, never accountability for my pain. So I told her the truth. I said I was not the one doing this. She and Ray had done it 15 years ago when they decided a child's inheritance was theirs to occupy, and a child's place in the family was negotiable. All I had done was stop helping them pretend. When they were finally outside with armfuls of bags and boxes, the scene looked almost too fitting. The same front steps, the same doorway, the same house. Only this time I was not the child being sent away. I was the lawful owner watching the people who stole my home lose the shelter they built on selfishness. Before leaving, Ray turned back once with a look that promised he still wanted the last word. He did not get it. Rebecca handed one deputy the paperwork documenting visible damage and improper alterations to the property, and I saw something collapse in Ray's face that anger alone could not explain. It was not just that he had lost the house. He had lost the fantasy that there would never be a bill for the damage people like him leave behind. After the vehicles pulled away and the noise faded, I stood there for a long moment before walking inside. The house smelled wrong at first, stale and crowded and unfamiliar. But beneath all of that, faint and stubborn, was something I recognized from childhood: wood, dust, old paint, memory. I walked through each room slowly. The living room where my father once fell asleep with a baseball game on. The hallway where I had been told to pay rent at 9 years old. The kitchen where I used to sit on the counter and steal strawberries from the bowl before dinner. I touched the door frames like I was reintroducing myself to a language I had once spoken fluently. Ethan followed behind me without interrupting the silence. In the back bedroom, I finally cried, not because I regretted what I had done, but because I understood how long I had been carrying that little girl with the packed bag inside me. Getting the house back did not erase what happened to her. It did something more honest than that. It told her she had been right all along. She had not imagined the injustice. She had not overreacted. She had not been too sensitive. She had been wronged, and one day she grew into someone strong enough to prove it. Over the next few months, Ethan and I repaired everything we could. We stripped out the worst of the careless changes. We repainted the walls. We restored the front porch. I placed one framed photograph of my father in the entryway where no one would ever hide it again. When our wedding came, I walked out of that house in white instead of walking out with a bag. That mattered to me more than I can explain. And if there is any lesson in all of this, it is not that revenge feels good. It is that silence should never be mistaken for surrender. Sometimes people stay quiet because they are young, cornered, grieving, or simply waiting until they have the strength and the proof to defend themselves the right way. Family is not defined by who can claim you when it benefits them. Family is defined by who protects your dignity when you are too small to protect it yourself. And when that protection fails, the answer is not bitterness, and it is not violence. It is patience, truth, boundaries, and the courage to use the law to defend what is yours. My father left me a house, but the greater gift turned out to be the lesson hidden inside the fight to reclaim it. Love without respect is not love. Blood without loyalty is not family. And no one who profits from your pain gets to call your self-respect cruelty. If you have ever had to fight your way back to something that should never have been taken from you, then you already know this. Healing does not always look soft. Sometimes it looks like standing on your own front lawn at sunrise, watching the lie end, and finally walking back into your life through the same door they once forced you to leave.